Hello, everybody who is in this course in person and who may be watching a recording later. I am Michael Sunleitner, and this is a course on Gandhi and King, soul force, and social change. That was and is the title of my doctoral dissertation and book by the same name. With regards to Martin Luther King, we are starting the second half of the course with him. And we will be spending the next 4 weeks, 3 days a week, 80 minutes each of those days, focusing on Martin Luther King, his life, and his ideology, his worldview, and his message to the world. And so we begin today. Welcome all of you in the first session on Martin Luther King. As many people here attending know, we spent the last 5 weeks on Mohandas K. Gandhi, a tremendous influence on Martin Luther King. And so we are always open to comparing Gandhi and King. Many of those who have attended this course for the past 5 weeks may still have questions about Gandhi, and that's fine. We can integrate those in. Integrate is a very intentional word. Martin Luther King believed in integration, not just integration, social and political integration, stopping the discrimination of Black Americans by white Americans and bringing down segregation as a formal policy. King believed in personal integration. He wanted you to integrate your ideas. He wanted you to expand your mind, to see all people as brothers and sisters, all people as members of the same family, regardless of religion or other apparent differences. So, we can begin. Why, you ask, is a white guy teaching a 4-week session on Martin Luther King Jr.? Good question. I'm sure some of you are having it in your mind. Well, King for me was one of my early heroes. I am 75 years old, and when I was only 13, I could see on television the police dogs attacking demonstrators in Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. And I remember that dramatically. I remember the blood. I remember the arrests. And I remember thinking, what is this about? Just as a very young person. King and the civil rights movement affected me personally, as a person. Yes, I am appearing white. But my study of King blossomed from there. I did participate in civil rights demonstrations myself. I did risk arrest. I did myself attend Fisk University, which is a historic Black university in Nashville, Tennessee. I attended there for half a year. I was one of only 6 white people in a student body of 1,500. And so I maybe am a little bit more understanding inside than my external appearance may give the impression. When I went to University of Minnesota for my doctoral dissertation, I undertook the study of King as well as Gandhi. For King, I interviewed over 20 people who had known him personally, including his best friend, Ralph Abernathy, his college roommate, and a person he went to theological seminary with. And I'll be discussing those in this session today. The president of Morehouse College, where King went to college, I also interviewed. John L. Lewis, who became a U.S. congressperson, I interviewed. So through interviews and reading about King, I became expert in his thinking and also in the civil rights movement. I have read everything that Martin Luther King ever wrote that has survived. Everything that is present at the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia, everything that is present in the Mugar Library at Boston University. I spent an entire month going through all of his college papers, reading everything that he wrote during his PhD program. And so I am more knowledgeable than many, even though I appear to be white, and certainly I can be criticized as not having lived the Black experience in America. There are limitations to everyone's understanding. But in my experience, I have much to share, and I hope to have other people share during this 4-week session. That was a long-winded answer to that question some of you had. Why is he teaching about Martin Luther King? Well, because I am able to. And you can take what I share as you like. I try to be unbiased, but all of us have a perspective. All of us are like blind people and the elephant. All of us are conditioned by our backgrounds and our experiences. And so I hope that you can still learn from me and learn with me. That said, typically these sessions have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion at the beginning. And I've taken that time, but I will ask in a moment, is there anything you would like to be sure we talk about? And then I will go on to share a timeline relating to to Martin Luther King's early life from 1929 to when he went to Montgomery, Alabama in 1954. So before he became the great activist we know, he was developing a worldview that would guide his activism. That is what we are focusing on today, his background, his influences in early life. Next class, tomorrow, we will be focusing on Martin Luther King's assumptions, his ideological assumptions, and we will see that his assumptions, beliefs, goals, and strategies are a blend of his Christian experience that has many, many streams informing it, including the Black experience of his Baptist church. It also includes a very strong element of liberalism, an ideology that dominates in the United States, whether we like it or not. And I don't much like it. And then also, he will be seen as having a strong democratic socialist influence that is far less well known, but toward the end of his life was becoming very prominent as he was calling on things like a guaranteed annual income for all Americans, education paid for all through college for all that are qualified. He believed not only in desegregation and integration, he believed in providing governments providing the basic needs of life for all of its citizens. He wanted to abolish poverty. And he was prepared at the end of his life to close down the government of the United States until they agreed to providing policies that would pay for a guaranteed annual income, national health care for all, education for all, open housing for all. He was aggressively planning a civil disobedience campaign that would have closed down the capital of the United States of America. So this is a preview. We're going back to his early life now, but you'll see within 4 weeks why he became, in the eyes of many, a threat to national security in the United States, and why he was assassinated, almost certainly with at least the passive, if not the formal endorsement of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the US government. He wasn't killed by a lone assassin. It was much more complicated, and we will get into that. Coretta Scott King, his wife, who survived him, firmly believed, along with other members of the King family, that Martin Luther King was killed by the US government. So, with that lighthearted statement, I hope that we can have fun learning about Martin Luther King. And since we're a relatively small, we've grown. We have a good attendance now. We will have time always to be interrupted. So if Amal, you would like to ask a question now, or perhaps 10 minutes from now, feel free to unmute, say something, and I will be happy to respond while you have the question in your mind. And if you want to be silent, I will myself intentionally be silent about 45 minutes from now. And so that
I wanted to ask
you can
Michael,
say something. Yes,
yeah,
Lubna.
I wanted to ask about your research.
Yes.
You have mentioned that you have interviewed 20 people, and primary information was from the books. Is there any other sources you used? Like, what type of study was that? Was it quantitative, qualitative, or mixed method study?
Well, the method was to read everything that I could find that Martin Luther King wrote, published as well as unpublished.
All right.
And also to interview people who knew him personally. And those are things that I did while they were still living. And so that makes me a fairly rare person. Ralph Abernathy is no longer alive. Yes.
So I think it is considered to be a mixed method study, qualitative and quantitative both.
Correct.
Yes. Okay. This is what I wanted to know. Okay.
I never interviewed Martin Luther King himself. I was not politically aware enough at that time to seek to find him, but by then he was so famous it would have been very difficult for me to visit with him. Thank you, Lubna.
Okay.
Okay. Well, let us begin. It may be interesting too, some of you, as we put up the handout I gave Harshal, I typed this. You can screenshot it. It will help you remember how to spell the names of the people that I am talking about. It will help you see from 1929, when Martin Luther King was born, to what transpired in his life until Montgomery, Alabama in 1954, when he became the activist we all have grown to know. Well, he was born in January 15th, 1929. He was born to Michael King Jr. and his Michael's wife, Alberta. That was father and mother. Michael, yes. Michael, not Martin. And so if this may be of interest to you, we will discuss it. Both Michael Sr. and Michael Jr. changed their names later, and we will see why. His grandfathers were A.D. Williams, who was a Baptist minister, and James Albert King, who was a sharecropper. Let us briefly mention that A.D. Williams was a minister, as Michael King Sr. was also a minister. So Martin Luther King Jr. became a minister in the tradition of his grandfather and father. And yet his mother and her background with her father, James King, was more humble. On one side, it was fairly middle class. On his mother's side, they were sharecroppers. Many people may have not heard of sharecropping, but after slavery was ended in the United States, though some would say it's never completely ended, ended in 1861, and then later during the occupation of the South by the North after the Civil War in the 1870s, many former slaves became sharecroppers. That is, they did not own land, but they would work for someone who owned land, and they would share the crop. That was their payment. The land would be owned by someone else, usually a white person, and the sharecropper would take some of the proceeds as payment, the labor of their own hands, and then the rest would go to the landlord. This is not an uncommon practice in India, in many other countries. It may surprise you that this was a practice in the United States. The former slaves were often kept very poor, and sharecroppers were always limited in their ability to save wealth and buy their own land or otherwise become really independent. In 1931, as you see in the timeline, the Reverend A.D. Williams dies. He was the minister of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. And he had built up that church from a congregation of only about a dozen to several hundred people. So A.D. Williams was a very successful Baptist minister, Christian preacher. Michael King Jr., who had married into the profession, I suppose, of being a minister, became a minister himself and took over Ebenezer Baptist Church. So Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta was the home to Michael King Jr., who became Martin Luther King. In 1934, you can see this was only at about age 5 for the young Michael. His father attended the Baptist World Conference in Berlin. We can discuss the Baptist Church, the Protestant traditions of the Baptist and the Black Baptist Church, if you like. But when King went to Berlin, Germany, for the Fifth Baptist World Conference, he became very, very impressed with the Protestant traditions of Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer who broke away from the Catholic Church in the 17th century. Martin Luther was a reformer of the church, protesting, that's what Protestant comes from, protesting away from the Catholic Church, many of its practices that had brought corruption. We can get into those details if you like, but let us just say that King's father changed his name to Martin Luther King Sr. in honor of Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer who founded what became the Lutheran Church, a denomination within the Protestant movement. Officially, Michael doesn't change his name on his birth certificate until 1957. And so he was well past his adult life when he officially changes his name to Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, in his youth, which is the period we're talking about now, he was known by his friends as Michael or Mike. And he had as a nickname, Tweed. Tweed. Well, tweed is a kind of cloth. Michael King loved to dress fancy. He liked to wear suits. At the time, the fashion included tweed suits, a cloth made of a particular type of material. And so he liked his clothing and his fashy dress enough so that his friends often called him Tweed, named after the clothing that he liked. I find that amusing, and you can see that Martin was we'll call him Martin now for the most part, rather than just confuse you with Michael. Martin was very different from Gandhi. Gandhi was extremely introvert. Martin was the life of the party. He loved to party. He loved to go out on dates. He loved to go see movies. He loved to dance. He was a ladies' man, meaning he really enjoyed the company of women. And let us say he dressed the part. A very different sort of personality from Gandhi. Not better, not worse, just very different. And Tweed became more comfortable in his lifestyle in 1941. At that time, he would have been about 12 years old, when the King family moved to a brick house just a few blocks from where they had lived before, not far. But the brick house was very middle class, was more than 2 stories high, and was a sign of the upward mobility of the King family moving into middle class Black society. And in this new environment, the young Michael had many friends, both Black and white. He had white playmates. He enjoyed playing with all kinds of kids, and he was a normal child, just very, very smart and very, very extrovert. In 1941, that same year, when he was 12 years old, Martin's grandmother, Jenny, dies. And this shows a side of the young Michael, who became Martin, that was very emotional, very sensitive. He was so very close to his grandmother that when she died unexpectedly, his grief, his sadness, had him run to the big brick house, and he jumped out of the second floor window. He tried to kill himself. He was so sad at his grandmother's death. He was very emotional. And this shows more about the King that we will come to know. Yes, he was extremely smart. Yes, he was very, very extrovert. And yes, he was strongly moved by emotions, feelings that he had for those who he cared about, especially. his family, his grandmother, and his community. He was emotionally moved, oftentimes to act, even when rationally it might not make much sense. He was often moved by emotions to undertake action. Thankfully, he did not kill himself, and he survived beyond age 12. Uh, I will mention one more thing, and then I'm going to pause and ask if you have comments. In 1942, when Martin Luther King was still Michael, being called Michael, he was 13 years old, and his best friend was a white child of the same age. Well, that white child's family was white and told their child that he could no longer play with the young Michael. He's black. Black and white are not together. You cannot play with him anymore. And this impacted the emotional young Martin Luther King Jr. in a way that is not mentioned in any biographies that I have seen. But I read a, a paper written by King himself in graduate school in Boston called An Autobiography of Religious Development. And in that paper, King himself says, I learned to hate white people. That's the words he used, hate. I learned to hate white people. When my best friend could no longer play with me, when his parents would not allow any contact with my family because it was black, the segregation of the South that everybody knew was there hit me hard. They took my best friend away from me. They, white people, took my best friend away from me. I hate white people. Now, when someone is 13 years old, one can understand how they might react that way, yes? But King held that hatred for several years, really up until at least the age of 17 or 18. What can we learn from that? When we look at Martin Luther King's ideological views beginning tomorrow, we will see that King will oppose segregation, not just as politically unjust. It is. And economically unjust. It is. When you separate black and white or any other peoples from one another, there is an inherent injustice. Yet for King, the greatest injustice of segregation is that it harms the personality of people. It scars your personality. It produces hate. When you put up walls separating people, segregating from them from one another, it was King's own experience at age 12, age 13, that this produces hate. You must bring down the walls, bring down the barriers. You must desegregate before you can integrate. We will see this as essential to understanding King later and his ideological perspective. That this experience of having been separated from his white playmate had a great impact upon King is obvious to me. I simply am surprised that it has not been explored by other scholars, and it is not mentioned in most biographies. So I mention it to you today Now you know more than, in that little bit, than most people in the United States or elsewhere. King graduates high school at age 15. That's very young. He skipped 2 years, the ninth and the 11th grades. He was allowed to move forward because he was very bright. He was very, very smart. And at the all black segregated Booker T. Washington High School, he had satisfied all of their curriculum requirements. It was a segregated high school in Atlanta. And Booker T. Washington was the first black high school in Atlanta, Georgia. It had been established only about 20 years before King graduated from it. So you can begin seeing that segregation where King lived in Atlanta, Georgia, was very deep. And for a great many years, decades after the slaves were freed, Black people did not have a high school to attend. They were denied education. So the young Michael was able to attend a Black high school. He could not attend integrated high schools because there weren't any, not in Georgia. And he excelled as a student at high school. Let us stop a moment. Any observations about Michael King up to the age of 15, when he was really young? Any thoughts or questions that you might have?
Michael, how popular is Martin Luther King as a pastor?
Let us just say he became a minister later. He wasn't a minister at age 15, but he grew up in a Baptist church. He grew up listening to his grandfather, A.D. Williams. He grew up listening to his father, King Sr., and they were dynamic speakers. The Baptist tradition of Christianity has great style. And I'll just put it that way. If you want to hear a great speech on a Sunday morning, go to a Baptist church. Some of the ministers are much more dynamic than others, but dynamism, the charisma, is common in that church tradition. Every sermon basically has three parts. There is the problem. Then there is the prophetic solution. And then there is, what can we do about it now? The Baptist tradition, problem, prophecy, and solution, action. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So every sermon, including those that Martin Luther King would give, always is not just entertaining, but it's designed to move you emotionally. Perhaps the problem is Rosa Parks, 1954, is not allowed to sit at the front of a bus. And they will detail that injustice. They will get the crowd excited and angry about the injustice. And then they will take a portion of the Bible to speak to that injustice. And the Baptist minister then plays a prophet. And it seems as if I can hear God saying that this is wrong. And they will kind of channel a prophetic message in the pulpit where they're speaking. And they will get the crowd very, very excited about the possibility of a future that can be prophetically better than the present. And then the last part of the sermon always focuses upon what can we do now? What can we do now? It mobilizes people to action. So Reza King was a great speaker, but he was raised in an environment of great speakers. Do you understand? And he was raised in a tradition of the Baptist Black Church that was an instrument to change the world.
Michael, I think William Carey is the founder of the Baptist mission, right?
Who?
William Carey?
William Carey. I don't know, but mission where?
I think
I
he
don't know.
was a close associate of Raja Ram Mohan Roy.
The Baptist Church goes back at least 300 years.
Okay, okay.
So I don't know about the person you just spoke. He may have been a prominently known person in India.
Yes, Professor Michael, he came to India, so the American Baptist, he was one of the ministers who came to India and spread Christianity, even in the Northeast India. So William Carey, yes, is well known among us.
Well, he's not
Uh,
well known among me. But that just goes to show that I don't know everything. But I'm sharing with you what I do know, okay? And I don't think this man was known to Martin Luther King Jr. That would surprise me. Another interesting thing about the Baptists is that they choose each church, local church, chooses their own minister. There's not a hierarchy like in the Catholic Church. You don't have a pope, cardinals, bishops, priests. In the Baptist Church, you can go to seminary and be ordained that way, but King himself and his father were ordained before they did any studies. They were made ministers before they went to school for theology. And they were chosen by their local congregation because they were known by the congregation as people who were highly respected and were dynamic speakers. They were people of faith. As we will see, Martin Luther King Jr. does go to seminary, and eventually he also goes to Boston University and achieves a doctorate. So he's the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., yes? He was highly educated, but his father and his grandfather were not highly educated. They were Christians in the Baptist tradition, chosen by their local churches for their faith. They were faith leaders, and they were democratically selected. So that is a very different sort of Christian tradition than many other, even Protestant churches.
Professor, just wanted to know, these Protestants among these denominations. So you said Lutheran was the first denomination.
Yes.
Okay. So all the denominations, not Roman Catholics, are called Protestants, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm saying that because not all Protestants like other Protestants. And so they might not all like to be considered in the same family as other Protestant groups. There's a lot of diversity within the Christian traditions.
Yes.
Michael, most of this Protestant, earlier groups has been originated and popularized by the English Church way back in England, and the
Yeah.
missionaries,
Okay.
and most
It,
of
it,
the
it,
missionaries came to India to spread the good news of Christ from the England, not from the US.
yes. And mostly they were Anglican. The Anglican Protestant tradition, I don't want to go too far into all of these traditions, but it was the Church of England. When King Henry VIII was a Catholic and wanted to have his marriage annulled, he wanted to divorce a woman who was not providing children for him and marry another. The Pope did not give him authority to do that. And so King Henry VIII founded the Church of England, which is also known as the Episcopalian Church. It was not so much in the tradition of Martin Luther and other Protestants. It was a church founded with the king as the head of the church. And so naturally, Anglicans were welcome in India, which was a British colony. Other Protestant groups were not as well appreciated by the British. I think partly because the British were concerned about controlling their colony and they did not want to upset local traditions. They wanted to make money. And if you upset too many Hindus, you're fighting to protect your properties rather than anything else. So mostly the British did not allow evangelical conversions. They did not encourage it in India because for them it was bad political policy. It would get too many people upset. The real evangelical Protestant traditions were coming to India mostly after independence. People that are really interested in converting people to Christianity. So that is a whole different line of discussion. But I think those of you, about half of you are from India, and others in Africa and elsewhere who are attending this class may have your own experiences with Christianity. All I am saying is the Baptist tradition of Martin Luther King was distinctive. It was distinctive in emphasizing democratic values and within the local church itself, in selecting who their minister will be, what the church will be doing in the community, what the programs of the local church will be. Among Baptists, these are local matters. And yes, they are happy to have people convert to Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. But the Baptists are at least as concerned about living the gospel as preaching it. Does that make sense? They are fond of saying, as Jesus said, it's not all those who say, Lord, Lord, who enter the kingdom of heaven, but those who do the will of my Father. Well, Jesus, what is the will of your Father? To clothe the naked, feed the hungry, visit those who are in prison. It is to do the will of the Father, not just to preach. The Baptists take Jesus's life and message to serve others very, very seriously. It's not just a matter of faith, it is a matter of action. That is the tradition of Martin Luther King. It is not so much the tradition of the Anglican Church. Though you will have members of the Anglican Church, including C.F. Andrews, a very close friend to Mohandas Gandhi. C.F. Andrews, of course, will become a strong activist within the independence movement in India. But C.F. Andrews was not well respected or liked within the Church of England. Martin Luther King Jr. was respected and loved within his Baptist tradition, because his Baptist tradition is committed to action. Are there other comments before we try to move a little bit further into King at college and King in the seminary, and King getting married, and King falling in love with a white woman? There are a lot of things that may be of interest before we finish our session today.
Maybe just shortly one question. Now we spoke a lot about like his father and his grandfather and like their tradition and their position in the Baptist church. Did they like in their church, did they already like address a lot of like racism issues, a lot of issues between white and black people, or was that something they kind of like left out and didn't really focus on?
Let's say they were not confronting the structures of their time. They were very aware of the structures of their time, and they protected as well as they could their members of their church who were being discriminated against. King's father was a member of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP was founded after about World War I time as a legal mechanism to fight in the courts for racial equality. So the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was a political reality in the King family. His father was an active member. King would become an active member. And that was primarily focused on the courts, where some victories against segregation could be had in the courts. And we can discuss those legal ramifications if you like. There were victories in the courts before Brown versus Education, 1954. There were a series of cases that went to the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, which indicated that, for example, if there is not a black law school in the state of Missouri, but only a white law school, if black people cannot become lawyers because of segregation, because there is no black law school, a ruling did take place by the Supreme Court saying then black people must be allowed to attend the white law school in Missouri. The segregation ideal of separate but equal cannot be equal if there is no option for a black person to go to law school. Equality is obviously not present when there is no option. When segregation prevents an entire race from becoming lawyers because there is no black law school, then they must be allowed to go to a white one. This was an NAACP victory in the courts. So his father, his grandfather, his whole community was daily aware of segregation and racism. And they fought it as best they could in the courts, but it was very, very dangerous to protest openly because you could be killed. We can discuss the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist organization that arose in the 1870s and which was extremely strong well into the 1940s, and where even they became less visible in the 1950s, there were white citizens' councils in places like Atlanta, Georgia. The mayor was white. The politicians that ran the city were white. The police officers were white. You don't really need a Ku Klux Klan when you can use the power structure of the white police force to beat up people and to kill them. So there was terror reigning through many states of the United States in King's youth, certainly in Georgia, where he lived. You protest too much, you may not be seen by your family tomorrow, and your body may never be found. This is the United States, land of the free, home of the brave. Not so much if you were non-white. And if you were white and you allied yourselves with people of color, oftentimes you were seen as a traitor. And you could be killed. And no one would be held accountable. I can tell you stories about that. But let's go back to King's youth. He graduates high school at age 15. He goes to Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, which is an all-black college. The president of the college, Dr. Benjamin Mays, is one of the people that I interviewed. And he was very close to the young Michael King when King was attending school. They would have meetings together, the president and Mr. King. And Mays is noteworthy in that he met Gandhi. He's one of the few people that Martin Luther King had contact with who had actually met Gandhi. Dr. Benjamin Mays had gone to India, had stayed some time with Gandhi, had came back. And when I interviewed Dr. Mays, I said, Dr. Mays, do you remember ever talking about Gandhi with the young Michael? And he said, I don't remember any of those conversations like that. Mostly we talked about what he was studying in school, what his future plans were. At the time, he wanted to become a doctor. When he was in college, he wanted to become a doctor. And so Dr. Mays talked about those things. But maybe Mays doesn't remember discussing Gandhi. Maybe Gandhi was discussed. It's possible. Martin's friend, Walter McCall, is mentioned in my outline. In Morehouse, Walter McCall was King's roommate in the dormitories. Walter McCall also became a minister. I interviewed Walter McCall. So Walter, what was Martin like? Well, first we called Martin Michael or Mike. And sometimes we called him Tweed because he still loved to dress well. And he was the life of every party, Walter said. He was loved to go out with women, loved to have fun. And according to Walter, who I interviewed in Walter's kitchen while Walter was eating fried chicken out of his oven, straight from the oven. It's a very strange interview. I audio taped it, so I have the tape. He was telling me, "Oh yes, well Michael, he was a ladies' man. He liked the women. When he left Morehouse College, 3 different women expected him to marry them, and they didn't know about each other, and none of them were his eventual wife. He was very different from Gandhi on a personal level. Yes." I'm thinking this is funny because it is in some ways part of a culture. Certainly not all people of color are like this, but often people who uh, experience oppression um, encourage male behavior that is more masculine as a way of compensating for the dehumanization that the male population is often experienced at the hands of white people. I'm not excusing anything, you understand? But I'm saying oftentimes there is, perhaps I've perceived a psychological desire to prove yourself as a man, especially when you can't go in the front door of a restaurant and you must use the back door to pick up your food because that's a blacks only entrance. You can't go into the whites only entrance. When you are humiliated structurally in your life every day, there may be some encouragement for you to find pride and respect in your masculinity in other ways. Does that make sense? In any case, King loved Hegel in college. Friedrich Hegel, the German. Some of you are from Germany. You know all about Hegel and Marx. King studied Hegel and Marx in college. And he especially liked Hegel's idea of the dialectic, that there is through history a zeitgeist, the spirit of the ages, an epoch from one period to another, where the dominant ideas of the time will conflict with the subordinate ideas, and they will clash, and out of that clash, there will be a new synthesis of ideas and a new epoch. So there's kind of a thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The idea of the dialectic appealed greatly to Martin Luther King Jr. And while he liked Marx's critique of capitalism, he did not like Marx's materialism. Of course, Marx proclaimed himself to be an atheist, and Martin Luther King was not an atheist. He was a great believer in God, yes? But he was inspired somewhat by Karl Marx's critiques of capitalism in college. Toward the end of his college period, he joined the NAACP, like his father had. At age 18, at the local chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, King found once again white people that he liked, white people that opposed segregation, white members of the NAACP. It was an integrated organization. And according to King's papers in college, King says that association with white people in college in the NAACP helped me get beyond my hatred for white people. But he hated white people for 5 years. And it was only when they were together in an integrated organization the NAACP, that King says he got beyond his hate. In fact, he went far beyond his hate when he went to Crozier's Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. King was an ordained minister at age 19. In 1948, when he went to seminary, he was already a minister. But he wanted to learn theology. He wanted to be an educated minister. Crozier in Pennsylvania was, of course, a primarily white seminary, very liberal, and we will see many influences upon him in his idea system later from Crozier. And I'm looking at the time, and it's flying by fast. At Crozier Seminary, King will be exposed to many theologians that will impact his theology, which becomes a very liberal theology. And I'll detail that in the sessions to come. Let us just say, though, on a personal level, he went with his friend Walter McCall, the one that I interviewed in his kitchen. Walter and Martin Luther King, he now called himself Martin after he was ordained at age 18. He now calls himself Martin all the time. So at the seminary in Pennsylvania, he and his friend Walter go to a restaurant. And this is in non-segregated liberal Pennsylvania. Somehow they offend the restaurant owner. He brings out a gun and orders them to leave his restaurant. At first, Martin and Walter said, no, we're not leaving. But then he becomes very threatening. So they do leave. They bring a court case against the restaurant. They have witnesses that saw this interaction. And then they discovered that the witnesses would not testify in court. So the case was dropped. King realized that even in the relatively white, non-segregated, liberal Pennsylvania in the North, racism was still there. And it was a dangerous place, even though the Ku Klux Klan might not lynch you, a restaurant owner might shoot you. He liked going out to restaurants. King, at a different restaurant, fell in love with the owner's daughter. She was a white woman. So he has gone from hating white people to actually loving this one. And he wanted to marry her. But everyone advised against it because of the segregation reality in the South, as well as the racist reality in the North. And they said, you will have too many struggles being a white-black interracial couple. In fact, in over half the states of the United States, it was illegal to marry outside of your race. So in many states, had Martin Luther King married this white woman, their marriage would not have been recognized. And he even could have been arrested for having married a white woman. So he doesn't carry on with that relationship. He finishes seminary, top of his class, his student body president of his class. He goes to Boston University on a scholarship. And in his last year at Boston, 1953, he mates and marries his future wife, Coretta Scott King. Coretta Scott came from a relatively wealthy family. She was studying to be an opera singer. She was musically inclined, but she fell in love with Martin Luther King because he was a ladies' man and he was very charming, and they loved each other dearly, and when they married, they moved back to Atlanta, Georgia, back to King's home. Just to fast forward so we have some time for discussion, King finishes his PhD in 1954. I interviewed his doctoral dissertation supervisor, L. Harold DeWolf. We can discuss King's dissertation at some time if you want. There has been some controversy about the dissertation because later King was accused of plagiarism in some of the writing of this dissertation book, comparing Paul Tillich and Henry Wyman, two Protestant theologians. King apparently borrowed a lot from the writings of somebody else. Some years later, he was accused of stealing the writings of others in his dissertation. The theft was confirmed, but his dissertation and his doctorate were not taken away because it was concluded that these academic mistakes were not essential to his thesis or to his conclusions. In defense of Dr. King, let me just say that in the tradition that he was a part of, from the sermons that you might give to the things that you might write, oftentimes quotations are made without mentioning the original author. It was commonplace for this to happen. I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying it's commonplace. And you will see oftentimes in King's sermons that he will quote from others and not tell you who he's quoting from. And it sounds a little bit like he's saying it himself. But that's not his intention. His culture was very much one that brought insights from others into the sermon in the church, and it was not unusual for him to bring insights of others into his own writing. When he finished his PhD, there was a choice. Are you going to teach or preach? Dr. King now you are, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Are you going to accept a teaching position at a university? He had several offers. Or do you want to preach like your father and your grandfather did before you? Fortunately for the United States and the world, King chose to preach. And he chose to take his first solo assignment as a minister in Montgomery, Alabama in 1954. And we'll stop here because it is in that year, his first year of being a minister on his own, that he begins leading a civil rights movement that will change a great many of the laws and impact the culture in the United States. So that is King's youth. We still have 10 minutes or more if you want to stay a little late. I haven't heard from many of our participants from Africa. I would love to hear from Mafugi or others if you have questions or comments that you would like to make. Please feel free to share. There are 20 of us in this session today. I would think about having small group breakout sessions. Perhaps we can do that tomorrow. I hope that many of you will come tomorrow and we can have maximum participation in small groups. But with only 10 minutes left today, to hear from you.
Okay. It is very fascinating hearing about Martin Luther King. At the age of very young age, he jumped to die for his grandmother. He is
Yes.
so much love in his heart, you know. So he shared his feelings, his love with me, the rest of the women in nearby him. So it's because he has so much love for the grandmother, for the family, for the parents, and later on it turns to the your ladies man. He has become the ladies man at the later age. It is nice. Now in this Asian country, we don't like this kind of personalities, but as you have mentioned that in your society it doesn't matter. And there is other thing you have mentioned that at the that time it was crop sharing in that area. In Bangladesh also we have that kind of culture in the village. Those who lives in the cities, they give their land to the poor people in nearby their households, and at the end of the cultivation, they have half and they give half to the landlord. It is in the practice in our country, in the village area, crop sharing.
Yeah,
And
Dr. Michael, we also have the same practices we still have in our
Okay.
villages, So this is the first time I'm hearing this word, sharecropper, right?
Yeah, I
So
love that word also. Yeah,
yeah,
crop sharing.
that it is still there.
We call in Bangla adi. I don't know adi. We provide adi to the poor people. But sometimes it's more like the poor, those who are our relatives, but very poor. They used to give that way, sharing their land with the uh, poor relatives, usually.
usually it keeps them poor. Usually
Yeah.
it keeps them poor. And usually the wealthy then become more wealthy. And it
Uh,
is a very
yeah,
medieval
yeah,
relationship.
Michael.
No, you know
In
what happened in Bangladesh? They keep a land to the two house or two rooms land, two rooms small house to leave them gi- to stay peacefully so that they can look after their land. It's not that they are now their children are studying, their children are maybe now, maybe in previous, maybe what you have mentioned, it is like that. But these days it's like that. They are also growing. They are also their students are getting graduate from the school and college. So and the landlord also support them to enrich.
I think Shushil wanted to speak. I heard the
Yes.
voice, but I would
uh,
especially like to hear from people from Africa. Thank you. Shushil?
yes, Mike. Yeah, yes, Michael. Actually, the thing is that most of these landlords, they're lending their farmlands to the tenant farmers, and these landlords are working in multinational companies or government jobs. Mostly they settled in urban areas, and their village farmlands has been cultivated by these farmers, and farmer has to pay a portion of this harvest or a rent to the landlord. But from past or 7 8 years, the respective governments in state of Telangana, they are paying 5,000 rupees annually per acre to the landlord, not to the tenant farmer. So what the people of this state asking the governments to pay also to the tenant farmers. I don't know, but why the government is paying only to the landlords, not to the tenant farmers?
Probably because the landlords give money to the politicians, either to their own pockets or to their campaigns. And it is similar in the United States, where
The landlord
big
itself
money,
is the landlord itself is a politician.
big money supports the politicians. The politicians make policies that support the big money. And this was something that is, of course, in addition to racism, very, very corrupting. And Martin Luther King was certainly very aware of it and was actively concerned about the power of big money in American politics. Um, One of the books that he read when he was in college was called The Power Elite by C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills is a white guy. But the power elite makes the case that in the United States, we don't have democracy. We have oligarchy. We have rule by the wealthy. We have those who control the politicians with their campaign contributions and wealth. King read this book and he agreed with the thesis that was given there. And throughout his later life, he would talk about, we need to make democracy real in the United States. It is not real now. There is a power elite that control the democracy in the United States. It's not really a democracy. So you can see that his roots in college, in seminary, and then at graduate school exposed him to writings from a wide variety of people that influenced him significantly. And we will discuss that beginning tomorrow as we begin looking at Martin Luther King's worldview and comparing it with Gandhi. So for those of you who are watching this session, this is number 16. Sessions 17, 18, 19 will be relating to King's worldview. We will systematically look at his assumptions, beliefs, goals, and strategies. And I hope that you can tune in for future sessions, or at least watch some of these if you find them useful in the recordings.